Imagine this. In the year 67 AD, you're strolling through the streets of ancient Rome when you come across something that chills you to your core. Nero, the emperor, is shown walking across the forum with a beautiful young woman wearing silver diamonds that seems to be his new bride. However, since everyone is aware of the terrible reality, murmurs follow them. A boy named Sporus used to be the woman next to the most powerful guy on the planet, and Nero's treatment of him is among the most horrifying instances of physical and psychological abuse in history. If you like discovering the little-known facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more posts like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and agony. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we are all studying these old tales from around the globe, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. You're not going to hear just another story about Roman excess. It tells the tale of how total power can turn grief into insanity, love into obsession, and a person into a living doll made to fulfill a single man's deranged desire. Even if you have never heard of Sporus before, his narrative will stick with you for a very long time. Let's begin with the man who would go on to mastermind this catastrophe. Evil was not innate in Nero. His early rule actually showed a great deal of potential. Many Romans thought they were seeing the beginning of a golden age when he took the throne at the age of 16. He supported public entertainment, lowered taxes, and even appeared in plays that delighted the general population. But even the most promising souls can become corrupted by ultimate authority. Additionally, the emperor's mental state had fundamentally collapsed by 65 AD. Perhaps it was the ongoing paranoia that results from knowing that everyone wants your job. Perhaps it was the loneliness that came with being the only individual in a 60 million person empire who could never be challenged, refuted, or informed they were mistaken. Or perhaps it was the fate of the one person he said he loved more than life. She was named Poppaea Sabina and was all that Nero believed a man could desire in a woman. Beautiful beyond words, smart enough to match his own lofty self-image, and driven enough to share his aspirations for eternal glory. Poppaea, however, was more than just another attractive person in the imperial court. She had the kind of keen political intuition that might make her a formidable friend or a perilous foe. Nero was already wed to Octavia, the former emperor's daughter, when he first saw Poppaea. It was a chilly, loveless political union. Poppaea stood for all that Octavia did not. Poppaea was vivacious and dominant, in contrast to Octavia's calm and restrained demeanor. Poppaea thrived in being the focus of attention, whereas Octavia tried to escape it. Nero and Poppaea's affair started off as a standard Roman scandal. However, what began as adultery soon became into a real infatuation that was far more hazardous. Nero was drawn to more than just Pompeia's beauty. Even his closest advisors were frightened by the manner he was absorbed by her. According to ancient historians, Nero became more unpredictable and possessive around this time. If other men even glanced at Poppaea for too long at public events, he would get enraged and homicidal. He started keeping guards about her constantly, supposedly for her safety, but really to keep an eye on all of her interactions. He showered her with presents that caused the imperial treasury to go bankrupt: fragrances from Arabia, silks from China, and jewels from India. Perhaps most tellingly, though, he started to alter reality to fit his fixation. In the beginning, he shocked many followers by divorcing Octavia. Then, in a formal imperial ceremony, he declared his plan to wed Poppaea. Nero went all out to show his devotion, and the wedding was a spectacle of unheard-of splendor. Marriage was insufficient to fully satiate Nero's craving to own Poppaea. He surrounded her with people who owed their jobs solely to his favor, isolating her from friends and relatives. In order to view her picture even when they were away, he commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures of her for both his private rooms and public display. According to ancient accounts, Nero would occasionally observe Poppaea go about her everyday business for hours on end. This was not a passionate act of devotion. It was the actions of someone who mistook love for possession and who viewed another person as a lovely thing that existed only to satisfy his desires rather than as an autonomous individual. For her part, Poppaea appeared to be aware of the risky game she was engaged in. She had the intelligence to understand that her beauty and Nero's passion gave her unparalleled power. but she was also astute enough to see that this power came with a lot of hazards. She started leveraging her position to further her family's goals and assembling a network of allies who would defend her in the event that Nero's love ever faltered. However, Poppaea had a deadly weakness. She didn't hesitate to confront Nero. Poppaea maintained her independence of spirit, in contrast to the other members of the imperial court who had mastered the art of reading the emperor's moods. She would critique his artistic endeavors, debate with him over policy choices, and even make fun of his performances when she felt they were lacking. Depending on whose ancient historian you trust, the specifics of what transpired on that fateful day in 65 AD differ, but the conclusion was always the same. The emperor lost control in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life, during what began as a routine marital dispute, according to some accounts of Nero's tardiness, returning home from chariot racing, and others concerning his theatrical endeavors. Tacitus claims that when Poppaea ventured to question Nero's intentions and implied that he was more concerned with maintaining his public persona than with his duties as a husband and father, the dispute heated up. Perhaps the stress of being pregnant with their second child at the time made her less tolerant of Nero's more unpredictable actions. Historians have argued about what transpired for decades, but most agree that Nero, in a moment of wrath, kicked or hit his pregnant wife so viciously that she suffered fatal internal damage. According to some accounts, she only received one strike to the abdomen. Others tell of a prolonged assault that left her unconscious and bleeding on the marble floor. Consider the instant when Nero became aware of his actions. The man who was revered as a god in the eastern provinces, led 30 legions, had the power to have anyone put to death with a single word, and had just destroyed the one thing he truly cared about. His own unchecked violence was killing the lady he had become enamored with. Ancient sources described the scene that followed as one of the most pathetic in imperial history. Nero reportedly threw himself on Poppaea's body, alternately begging her forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if his imperial authority extended even over death itself. He called in Rome's top doctors, promising them riches to save her life and threatening to torture them if they didn't. However, it was too late. Poppaea took the unborn child who might have been Nero's heir with her as she passed away in a matter of hours. Something basic shattered inside the emperor's head at that very instant. The ensuing sadness went beyond just emotional destruction. It was a total departure from reality. The grief of Nero became legendary. Instead of having Poppaea's body burned, as was customary in Rome, he had it embalmed and interred in a more ornate tomb than those of earlier emperors. He proclaimed her to be heavenly, created a cult in her memory, and spoke to her body for days as though she could still hear him. Now, the imperial court had to negotiate a much more perilous terrain. It was expected of courtiers to engage in the fiction that Poppaea was still alive in some way, using the present tense while speaking of her and leaving her favorite feast seat unfilled. The emperor expelled, or worse, anyone who urged he should go on. During this time, Sporus first came into view of Nero, but the young guy was unaware that he was about to enter a nightmare. Born into slavery in the imperial family and set free as a child, Sporus was most likely 14 or 15. He had been educated to perform administrative tasks while growing up behind the palace gates. In actuality, this was a relatively privileged position. Compared to freeborn residents of lesser classes, freedmen in imperial service frequently had superior living conditions. However, this benefit came with total reliance on imperial favor. Due to their former master's generosity, freedmen were completely vulnerable. They might gain a lot of power, but they could also be arbitrarily cast aside, punished, or killed without any legal redress. In Nero's opinion, Sporus was unique not because of his brains or abilities. His face was it. According to some old accounts, the young guy remarkably resembled the deceased Poppaea, especially in the areas surrounding his eyes and fragile bone structure. This resemblance would have appeared nearly miraculous in a society where Romans thought physical similarities signified a deeper spiritual connection. Something sparked in the emperor's fractured mind the first time Nero saw Sporus following Poppaea's passing. This was his chance to restore what he had destroyed and undo the irreparable. For a brief moment, Nero might have thought he was witnessing Poppia's spirit reincarnating in a different form because of how strikingly similar they looked. There was one clear issue, of course. Sporus was a man. However, changing someone's gender seemed like a little hurdle to a man who had spent months conversing with a corpse and had convinced himself he was a god. One of the most well-planned acts of brutality in human history is what transpired next. Sporus wasn't simply made to dress like a woman by Nero. He made the decision to permanently change. To make the young guy look more feminine, the emperor called up Rome's top doctors and gave them instructions to operate on him. This went beyond simple mutilation. It was the methodical eradication of Sporus's human identity. The process was risky, excruciating, and irreversible. It frequently led to infection or blood loss-related deaths. Even if Sporus lived, however, his physical, emotional, and social makeup would be irrevocably altered. He would never be able to have children, have regular relationships, or even be regarded as a man in Roman society. The procedure was performed in specially designed operating rooms in the imperial palace. Using simple tools and unrefined anesthetics, ancient surgical techniques were archaic. There would have been a serious chance of mortality during the agonizing, hours-long procedure. Knowing that his cries would go unheard, doctors would have approached with their equipment while soldiers held Sporus down. After weeks or months had passed since Sporus's recovery, Nero made an announcement that even the most cynical Roman nobles found shocking. He intended to have a full imperial wedding ceremony to wed the young man. The preparations used a lot of resources and took months. In order to prepare for his new duty, Sporus was placed in special chambers and given a new name, Sabina, after the deceased empress. An entire wardrobe was made by imperial seamstresses who designed dresses that would cover up his residual masculine traits and accentuate his altered body. For him, master jewelers created unique pieces, many of which used stones that had originally belonged to Pompeia. These were more than merely accessories. They served as physical connections to the deceased woman. Tangible remembrances of the individual Sporus was compelled to replace. He learned cosmetic treatments from makeup experts to feminize his looks. They demonstrated for him how to apply rouge for flushed cheeks, use kohl to enlarge his eyes, and soften face angles using powders. These were not merely aesthetic teachings. They were exercises in methodically erasing his former self. He learned intricate style skills from hairdressers, which were popular among Roman women of the nobility. His hair frequently included pricey decorations and was trimmed, curled, and styled in intricate designs. The procedure, which calls for several staff and hot metal equipment, might take hours each day. However, training in feminine conduct and deportment were possibly the most detrimental to psychological health. Sporus was given teachers who showed him how to sit, walk, and make ladylike gestures. In order to project elegance rather than masculine strength, he studied how to hold his hands, place his feet, arrange his clothes when seated, and move across space. His speech patterns were altered by voice instructors, who taught him to talk in higher tones and use linguistic emphases linked to feminine discourse. Given how hard it is to intentionally alter firmly learned voice patterns, this was possibly the most difficult part. Can you picture the psychological torment that this metamorphosis would cause? Sporus had to look into mirrors every day, seeing a stranger wearing his face reflected back. He was constantly reminded that his identity was being methodically obliterated by every lesson in feminine behavior. All of the jewelry that had previously been worn by a deceased woman was now shackling him to a role he had never chosen. The spring of 67 AD was chosen for the wedding because it fell during a religious festival, which would have given the ceremony more significance. Nero went all out, portraying it as a respectable imperial wedding fit for the greatest Roman emperor. The ceremony was held in the grandest palace hall, which was lit by thousands of oil lamps and embellished with imported flowers. While servants provided the best wines and treats, musicians performed traditional wedding tunes. Without knowing the whole background, it would have appeared to be a typical imperial wedding to outside spectators. However, those in the dark realized they were seeing something strange and unheard of. The world's most powerful man publicly wed a teenage boy who had undergone surgery to look like his deceased wife. All of the customary Roman rites were performed throughout the ceremony, including vow exchange, handshakes, sharing of holy bread, signing of legal papers, and officializing the union. The visitors performed their roles with skillful acting, expressing appropriate joy while congratulating each other and giving pricey presents. The barely disguised terror, intrigue, and anxious energy that comes from taking part in something essentially wrong, however, must have permeated the mood. Nero treated Sporus the same way he would have a real empress after the wedding. The young man got money from the imperial treasury, housing within the palace complex, and his own domestic staff. He had his own entourage of supporters, horses for riding, and a litter for traveling. However, the cost of all this apparent luxury was exorbitant. Total erasure of his true self, and ongoing portrayal of a role that is psychologically damaging. Sporus was supposed to sit next to Nero at state meals, go to public events with him, and act as the loyal wife in all encounters. This went beyond appearances. It appeared as though Nero sincerely thought he had brought Poe back to life. He would address Sporus by the name of his deceased wife, recall past encounters that had never occurred, and anticipate answers that would keep the intricate fantasy going. For Sporus, each day turned into a high-stakes game in which even the smallest error could result in death. He needed to recall how to react as though he were well-liked himself, in addition to how to act and look like a lady. Sporus was required to behave as though he remembered the incidents from his former marriage when Nero brought them up. According to ancient accounts, Sporus grew more adept at this trick and gained a near-supernatural capacity to predict Nero's emotions and react accordingly. However, they also observe that over time he became increasingly reclusive and depressed, yet continuing to perform his designated role in public flawlessly. It's nearly impossible to imagine the psychological pressure. Sporus awoke each morning to chambers arranged to evoke memories of a deceased woman he had never met. He didn't look like himself in any of the mirror reflections. He had to pretend to be someone else in every interaction, with memories and experiences that weren't his own. Sporus led this strange life for more than 2 years. But when Nero made the decision to visit Greece, his anguish took on new dimensions. The emperor considered himself to be an artist and was keen to participate in Greek festivities in the hopes that his skills would be suitably recognized. Naturally, Sporus went with him, posing as the Empress of Rome for foreign guests. Imagine Greek aristocrats attempting to understand their conqueror, who was traveling with a little boy disguised as a woman, and insisting that everyone take this blatant fabrication at its value. But by 68 AD, the Roman establishment had finally been overtaken by Nero's excesses. Governors, fed up with the emperor's capricious actions and disregard for governance, spearheaded uprisings throughout the empire. The Senate denounced Nero as an enemy of the state, and the Taurian Guard voiced resistance to his continuing rule. Sporus was part of the small number of followers that Nero had when he eventually left Rome. The emperor was unable to abandon his live remembrance of Poitiers, even in the face of death. They took refuge in a villa outside of Rome as they awaited capture or rescue. Nero, on the other hand, cycled between theatrical suicide preparations and extravagant escape schemes. When Nero learned that his adversaries were getting closer, he ultimately decided to die rather than be captured. However, as one of the most obvious representations of Nero's rule, his death left Sporus extremely vulnerable. He was both a priceless asset and a risky liability for the next person to assert authority. Perhaps even more terrible was what transpired thereafter. Sporus turned into a political pawn that was transferred like priceless property from one influential man to another. Nidius Sabinus, and Vitellius were the first to claim him. They all treated him similarly to Nero, keeping him clothed in female clothing and referring to him by Poea's name. Vitellius was the one who brought Sporus's horror to a close. In order to amuse the crowd, the new emperor chose to have him perform violent and humiliating events from mythology at the Colosseum. For Sporus, being sexually humiliated in front of thousands of people for their pleasure was the height of degrading treatment. Instead of enduring this ultimate humiliation, Sporus took the only decision he had made in years that was genuinely his own. He killed himself sometime in 69 AD, most likely by poisoning. He was most likely no older than 20. Sporus eventually left the hideous drama that had engulfed his life in death. His narrative turned into a warning about the perils of unbridled power and the human cost of imperial excess. However, it appeared that ancient historians were more interested in Sporus as a representation of imperial decadence than as a person. The continuous deprivation of his identity and agency, in addition to the torture he suffered, is what makes his narrative so eerie. misery. As soon as Nero concluded that Sporus looked like Papias, he stopped being a real person, and instead became the object of the emperor's deranged imagination. Sporus chose death over more humiliation, indicating that some of his true self survived beneath the layers of imperial conditioning and forced femininity. His suicide was a tragic act of defiance, a refusal to be further degraded, even at the expense of his life. Sadly, we don't really know anything about Sporus prior to his metamorphosis. What dreams and aspirations did he have? What was the purpose of his life? When he transformed into Nero's living doll, all of that was lost in favor of a performance so comprehensive that his true self vanished completely. After years of physical and psychological abuse and being forced to become an empress, the boy ultimately decided to die rather than suffer any more degradation. His tale is worthy of being remembered as a monument to human cruelty and tenacity, as well as an intriguing anecdote from ancient Rome. By deciding to end his own life, Sporus regained the one thing that had been taken away from him during his adult life: the ability to decide his own destiny. His tale serves as a reminder that, despite the enormous gap of 2,000 years, there are unique human tales of adversity and survival hidden beneath every historical account of imperial splendor. These tales merit our consideration and sympathy.